Thanks, Concord. Well, just on this section of amendments, I mean, I think we have to step back and look at why is this legislation even before us at this 11th hour of this stalled term. And it's precisely because the rental market has gone mad, that the price of even a modest dwelling in any town now is beyond the limits of people in even what we would call a decent job. And this is supposed to be some effort to deal with that scenario, not to mind the people who are below the middle, for want of a better word, and who are really struggling and can't come up with the money to keep a roof over their head. And the reason why the problem is so critical is because of the successive government's over-reliance on the private housing market to deliver housing or a roof over your head, which is in fact a social need and should be treated as a right. Now, what we're supposed to be doing here is dealing with rent certainty, and the reason why we supposedly can't talk about rent controls is of a previous Supreme Court ruling. But that ruling wasn't actually about rent controls. It was really about rent freezes in a scenario whereby people would have indefinite security of tenure. The two issues had to be there. So rent controls or rent certainty, or whatever you want to call it, is actually a different thing. And what we should be trying to do here, and what my group of amendments here tried to do, is to absolutely, yes, allow for increases, but stop a free-for-all. The increases have to be gradual. They have to be pegged to the rest of the situation in the economy, such as, for example, the rate of inflation. I don't see what's unreasonable about that. I mean, that has to be the starting point. And it's done against the backdrop that that hasn't been happening, where we've had a scenario of, in some instances, a 50% rise in rents. We know that average rents nationally have increased 30% since 2011. And what we're trying to do in this measure, and the idea of rent control really, is a tacit acceptance of a few things. Firstly, that a house and your home shouldn't be a commodity. It should be there to fulfil a social need. That the rental-free market leaves renters in a vulnerable situation, and that there should be regulation with regard to that. And that uncontrolled rental market is bad for landlords and tenants, and to permit massive rent hikes doesn't really suit anybody. So that's what we're trying to do with these group of amendments. Now, there are two types of rent control: controls within a tenancy and rents controlled on the commencement of a tenancy. Now, if you look at the situation for Germany, which is put up as the sort of gold star model, rent controls within a tenancy are what Germany has had for many years, and they've worked quite well. Berlin, for example, brought in much more stringent rent controls this year to also control rents at the beginning of a tenancy, and precisely because of a massive influx of foreign capital looking for a safe haven in the wake of the financial crash, which caused an imbalance in the rental market in that city. And that's precisely the situation that we're dealing with here, driving up rents beyond people's capacity to pay. It's the exact same scenario here. Now, in Berlin, as a result of that, landlords cannot now set the rent for a new tenancy at more than 10% of the prevailing local average, as contained in the rent mirror produced by the local authorities. Now, in Ireland, we need both types of rent control, but we're only providing here for the mid-tenancy controls in these amendments. And that's all. So we're being incredibly modest. We're not even dealing with the full picture here. And the reason for that is precisely that I do understand and appreciate that the market here is a little bit more complicated because of the numbers of accidental or reluctant landlords, or those who bought the buy-to-lets for the pension or whatever, some of them who are renting elsewhere themselves. I mean, it's an absolutely ridiculous situation. So controlling initial rents to a particular percentage above the local average is something that we absolutely have to be maintaining and aiming for. I don't see why that isn't factored in this at all. We do have to have a comprehensive review of the mortgage market so that any controls, are balanced and don't have an unintended consequence on the economy, for example. But we need to do that research. That's why the idea of a review provision that I put forward in these amendments is necessary, in my opinion, because we need to be looking at the control of initial rents as well, which is nowhere provided for in this legislation. So I would say that the amendments here that I have are relatively modest. They're a view to having people a little bit more secure in their home and putting a brake on the most unscrupulous of landlords. But we should be doing much more detailed research about how to bring the situation far better across the board. I mean, you've referenced a couple of times, Minister, that as far as you're concerned, the biggest problem is supply and increasing supply. But I can't take that seriously from the government when I look at what you've allowed NAMA to do. I mean, in the last month, ye have allowed the Project Arrow portfolio to be sold to Cerberus for less than $1 billion, for $800 million, when you know that 50% of that portfolio is residential units. And on the other hand, you're telling NAMA to use money to build 20,000 units over 5 years for the private market, again, with only a 10% social component. So it's utterly ludicrous. What's needed is not more supply, but it is more certainty, and absolutely more supply, but more supply in terms of the provision of social housing. The private market cannot deliver and meet people's housing need, which is why even under capitalism in the rest of Europe they can regulate and manage this situation. Surely to God we can do that as well. And the last point I'll make, Minister, is in relation to your comments about the PRTB, who are the biggest joke in this society as far as I am concerned. They are an absolute disgrace, whether by design or ineptitude, I really do not know. But they have been toothless in defending tenants and indeed in defending decent landlords as well, because of the way in which they've been set up. Possibly it's as a result of the fact that they've been set up without enough meat to compel people around the table to enforce judgments that are being made. And it's not just tenants. Tenants are, in many instances, hard done by. Those points have been made. Many small landlords are incredibly hard done by as well. And when people get, for example, payments from the state for rent supplement, fail to give it to a landlord, people who trash the dwelling and then are left in that dwelling for months at a time, don't go to PRTB hearings and so on, that's not good enough. We do need to tighten up on the whole security and decent relationships, and unfortunately our legislation here favours unscrupulous landlords and unscrupulous tenants, but the bulk of people aren't in that category. Most tenants are decent and just want a roof over their head, and a big chunk of landlords are okay as well. They just want their investment protected, a certain amount of return. But the real moral of the story is that if you want to meet people's housing needs, you can't rely on the market, and sadly these measures aren't going to give people the certainty that they need and that they deserve.